AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of interviews with former senior intelligence officers and those who do remarkable things in that field. And today I have a remarkable guest. His name is Michael Bergman. He is the CEO of Global Reach. He is the vice president and executive director of the Richardson Center for Global Engagement. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. He's been involved in a large number of hostage release negotiations. In 2019 and 2023, he and former Governor Bill Richardson were actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And in 2023, he was awarded the James Foley Award for hostage negotiations. Mickey, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you, James, for having me.
If you don't mind, let's start with telling the audience a little bit about your early life and how that affected later career choices.
Yeah. So I grew up, I was born and grew up in Israel. And my accent, I've been here for 24 years. My accent doesn't escape. I tried. But I served in the Israeli military for about 6 years. Most of my service was in South Lebanon. That was the times, the 90s, where Israel was in South Lebanon. Now Israel is kind of back in South Lebanon, at least for now. And I think that through that service, and that was in a combat position as an officer, it was my first encounter. We were embedded with the population in South Lebanon. It was one of my first encounters in realizing that that conflict, hatred, violence, it doesn't necessarily stem from what it appears to be, meaning the religious motivations or anything like that, but it actually stems from very basic human needs for own agency and for their own future and stability for families and kids of said family. And many times religion and other nationalistic arguments just fall very, very receptive ears under tense conditions. And that's when it manifests itself into this kind of conflicts. And I learned that because in the early 90s, in South Lebanon especially, the Israeli Defense Forces had allies. And that was the South Lebanese army that we used to work with, train with, and conduct our security operations with. And that was at the time that there was still a civil war in the rest of Lebanon. And South Lebanon was more stable because of this security umbrella that the Israeli Defense Forces had. And as the 90s started progressing, the war in the rest of Lebanon eased down and started stabilizing, and Lebanon started building up. But all the violence started shifting towards the south because there was a motivation to get the Israelis out of South Lebanon as an occupying force. And at that point, the same people in the villages, the same people that we were working with all these years, looked around and said, wait a minute, we used to have the peace and quiet here, and the war was in the rest of Lebanon. Now, the rest of Lebanon is quiet, but we have war here. That's because of you. And so everything started shifting, and our allies became enemies of ours. And it's not that dissimilar from what the US has experienced in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's the same dynamic. Every single individual there asked themselves the question, who's going to be in charge tomorrow? Because according to the answer to that, that's how you show loyalties, because you need to protect your family. So it's a long way, James, of saying that one of the biggest lessons, early lessons I've learned in this kind of field was from my military service, and understanding that it is about humans and human needs, much more than grandiose policies and national interests. In a way, I didn't know it as such, but it was a very human-centered approach, which since then I've learned to be the North Star for me in all of these activities that I'm taking. Out of the military, I was sent to the United States for a summer. It was like a little bit after 5 years of military service. Before my 6th year, they allowed me to either go to Poland for a week to visit the camps or to go to California for a month to participate in a young adult summer camp. Guess which one I chose? I went to California. And little did they know that I will find a girl there that I will be chasing all the way to California from Israel. Successful chase. She's my wife of 22 years. But that's how I ended up in the United States. And I'll tell you, one of the way I actually got into this work, because it never even occurred to me that's something that I will do, was in 2006. I got a phone call from one Governor Bill Richardson with a very rough voice on the other side. And he's like, "Is this Vicky Bergman?" I said, "Yeah. I need you to pack your stuff and get your ass to Santa Fe. You're coming with me to Khartoum." And James, not only did I not know Governor Richardson, I didn't know the man existed. And I had 48 hours to figure out whether this is an opportunity of a lifetime or whether this is the stupidest mistake I make before my head gets separated from my body, because I was, at that point, not even an American. I was still an Israeli in the process of becoming an American. And I was still an officer in reserves in the Israeli Defense Forces. So I decided to go. I consulted with some of my mentors and colleagues and my wife, of course, and I decided to go to Santa Fe, meet the governor out of respect, and then nicely and gently bow out of the mission. And I went over there and I had lunch with him. And at the end of the lunch, I said, "Hey, Governor, can I talk to you for a minute?" He said, "Yeah, of course." And I said, "Look, I have to tell you, like, I'm like, not only am I Israeli, I'm an officer in reserves, and, you know, things can go really bad really quickly, and I don't want to risk the mission. So maybe it's better that I don't go." And he just looked at me and he kind of waved it off. He's like, "No, you can't. I vouched for you with the Sudanese. I told them I know you for 6 years. You're coming with me." And then he looked at me and he had the very silly smile on his face. He said, "Do you know what I'm famous for?" I said, "What is that, Governor?" He says, "You get people out of jail. So worst comes to worst, you spend a couple of months in the Sudanese prison. Think what it will do to your career." He was laughing. And that's when my wife got the phone call with the jet engine sound in the background telling her, "Honey, I need to go with this guy." And we went. And that was my first mission with the governor. And James, it blew my mind. Because, yes, he was governor at the time, but he was on that mission as a private citizen. And I saw how, without any authority, he was able to use emotional leverage in his relationship with the president of Sudan at the time, Bashir, to convince him to do something that Bashir was not intended on doing before. And there are just little things about it and the conduct of how he did it that just absolutely astonished me. And it's like when you go and you play golf for the first time, and one time you swing and you hear that pure sound of connecting the club to the ball and it flies out there. And from that point on, you're hooked. You are in constant search of that swing. That's how this feels like. Once you've done it once and you saw the ability to influence and to create tangible things, you can't look away. And so from that point on, I just kept coming up with opportunities and ideas between me and the governor of how to do more and more. Eventually, it led to the establishment of the Richardson Center a few years later when he officially left office in 2011. And I've been doing it ever since.
Tell us how you got involved in the Gilad Shalit case.
Yeah, so that's when we came back from Sudan. That was early 2006. Governor Richardson immediately started his presidential campaign. It was a very short-lived presidential campaign, primaries, but that's the time. It was about 6 months after Gilad Shalit was taken by Hamas in Gaza. And I realized, based on my work and my relationships, I realized I had a contact between me and the Israeli Prime Minister. I had one person that I knew, which was Ami Ayalon, was a former minister, but also former head of the Shin Bet, who became a friend who I admire, and I had access to him. And he was a minister and a parliament member, and he had access to the prime minister. On the other side of it, one of my mentors at my job at the time at the Clinton Global Initiative was a guy named Rob Malley, who since then became the special envoy to Iran, and is now a little bit marred in a whole bunch of investigations. But Rob Malley at the time had direct contact with Hamas. And I realized that looked like on both sides, say, okay, I can get to Hamas, I can get to the Israelis. And now I also found this guy who's running for president in the United States that is crazy enough and willing enough to take risks. So I wrote a short memo to Governor Richardson, a page and a half. The title was The 6 Steps It Will Take for You to Bring Back Gilad Shalit Home. And I went and I gave it to him in a brown envelope in one of his stump speeches during his campaign here in DC. And the next morning he called me, 6:30 in the morning. He's like, "Are you up?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was sleeping." It's like, yeah. It's like, "It's a good idea." And it's like, "Good, thank you." He says, and then he kind of says on the phone, he's like, "Now go do it." It's like, "Me? I wrote it for you to do it." It's like, "Mickey, I'm running for president. You staff it, I back you up." And that was the entry point for me. For 18 months, we stepped in and mediated between Israel and Hamas. Of course, my 6 simple steps, turned into about 316 different simple steps that we had to take, because that's always how it works. But we have established the contact. We had to make contact with the family, with Gilad Shalit's father, get him to ask us to help, because that's the only mandate that we have, is when a family asks us to help, because we don't work for governments. We work on behalf of these families at no cost to them. So I had to go to the family to know his father, get him to feel comfortable enough to ask us to help, then build the credibility with the Israelis, build the credibility with Hamas, and a part that I didn't even expect, had to figure out how to navigate the Egyptians in all of this, because they saw themselves as the mediators, but they had different interests in the deal. It's not that they didn't want the deal to be made, but they wanted Egyptian interests to be held in that deal, meaning that Israel will maintain international responsibility for the wellness of the people of Gaza. And I'm saying that, James, because we're what is it now, 18 years since, and that is still a heart of the negotiations right now between Hamas and Israel over the hostages there, is Egyptian interest in making sure that the responsibility for goods and providing services and goods for the Palestinians in Gaza is still on Israel, and Israel wants to share that with Egypt. So it's a long way of saying that we stepped into this. We had a lot of mediation. We even had proximity talks between the two sides. I had the exchange of letters in my Gmail account between the Israeli government and Hamas leadership, signed by both sides. We did not conclude the deal. The deal was concluded a few years, 3 years after we have dropped from this. I'll explain why in a second. But the contours of the deal was exactly what we established on this, for better or worse. We had to drop after 18 months because President Obama won the elections, and he nominated Governor Richardson to be Secretary of Commerce. And at that point, the governor told me we can't keep playing with it, because that might be an embarrassment for the incoming president if it's revealed that one of his cabinet secretaries is actually negotiating or mediating with Hamas. So we had to drop off, and then another group, a British group and a German group, picked up where we stopped, and then they brought it to a conclusion.
Mickey, why did you go to North Korea? How did you get involved in the Otto Warmbier case?
Yeah, so I did. I was in North Korea actually several years before, about 6 years before Otto Warmbier was ever taken. We went there before Otto Warmbier. We had Kenneth Bay, another American that was held by the North Koreans, and his family asked Governor Richardson to help. And with North Korea, like in any other of these countries that are holding Americans, you can't get invited to negotiate the release of a political prisoner, because they will look at you and say, "We don't have political prisoners here. We have criminals." So you need to come up with another reason that is attractive enough for them, for you to go. And in 2010, we joined forces with Eric Schmidt, then the chairman of Google. He was very interested in going to North Korea. The North Koreans were very interested in meeting Mr. Google, that's how they called him, over there. And we thought it's a great opportunity because we were looking for any leverage that we can find. Because again, we're not government, to get in and to be able to talk to them about this. And so I traveled with Governor Richardson and with Eric Schmidt into North Korea. That was my first visit to Pyongyang. Learned a lot because they look at negotiations very differently. They look at the world very differently. And unlike most Americans prefer to talk to them as crazies or irrational, they're rational to a fault. We just need to figure out how they process the information they get and what is the information that they're getting into their calculations. But once you understand that, they're actually pretty rational and pretty predictable. Not in a, I'm not saying to dismiss them, but it's something that helps us understand how to communicate and how to get tangible things with them. And that visit ended up being very successful. I mean, Kenneth Bae was back home a year after that. But when Otto Warmbier was taken, those relationships that we've had were playing out, because you can't go into the middle of a crisis and out of the cold and try to establish trust with people you've never met before. But if it's people that you've worked with before and you never burnt them, even if you succeeded in getting what you wanted, you don't make them feel like you manipulated them or anything like that. You're respectful. We had an in and able to communicate with the North Koreans over this, and took some time, figure out how to get back into Pyongyang. But this time, James, there were two things. The official reason why we went was to negotiate the renewal of the program to bring back remains of American servicemen from the Korean War. There's close to 5,300 Americans whose remains are still there, and their families need closure. These are their kids, their grandkids. It's one of those things that we carry as a nation, and we have to complete that. And counterintuitively, the North Koreans are very interested in that too, because for them, James, they get cash for it because of the expenses and the fees of digging or finding those or treating those remains back. Second, they get contact with the American military. And it might sound counterintuitive, but the fact is that the military of North Korea likes to have contacts with the American military. It's a mitigating factor for everybody involved. And they don't want to pick up a war with us. So that's the second reason. And the third, for them, is because they know that plays the emotional strings of the American public. We all saw eventually when a year after my visit there, when they brought back remains, that was under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, more than 270 remains came back on this, how that played, because we are a country that values the phrase, we leave no one behind. And so even if it's 70 years later, we still work to bring them home. That was the issue that the North Koreans' eyes lit when we raised. So that was the official reason why we went. But they didn't want Governor Richardson there. Not because they didn't like him. They like him. A lot of people like him. They didn't want him because they knew that as soon as Governor Richardson goes there, it's headlines. And everybody knows why Governor Richardson goes. And everybody would know that it's Otto Warmbier. Me? Nobody cares about me. I'm a small guy. And so having me do these negotiations, it was more effective for the North Koreans. Governor Richardson was kind enough to not give me a hard time for it, but actually encourage me to do this. And I took two other men with me. One is Rick Downs, who is the president of the coalition of MIA and of missing Americans and fallen Americans from the Korean War. He lost his dad when he was 3 years old. His dad was flying in the Korean War and went down with his plane. And he's been working ever since to try and get him back. So I brought him with me in order to humanize this issue, but also to give him an opportunity to be as close physically to his dad as he's ever been in his life. And second, I had to bring with me a forensic anthropologist from Chico, California, named P. Wiley. And it sounds very random, but that's because if we were going to negotiate and maybe retrieve remains of Americans, I needed somebody who knows how to deal with that, on the procedures and respect that is needed in chains of custody. And I couldn't take anybody from the Department of Defense because we are informals. So we talked to the Department of Defense, and they recommended P. Wiley because he used to work with them as a contractor. And he knew that. So the three of us traveled over there, and we had a very, very successful trip, both on the remains issue and on the Otto Warmbier breakthrough that we needed. But it required a lot of emotional intelligence there in understanding not only what the leadership of North Korea wanted, but every individual down the chain, every single officer that was dealing with us, from the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs to the officer that was minding us, trying to get the authority of what we had and what we were there to offer, all of that. And that is something, again, that is most people don't understand. And I know that the constituents or the people who are listening to this get it. Because again, this is a very human-centered approach. You have to pay attention to every person, as low or as high on the chain, because they have a role. And it's not looking at them as a North Korean or as an American. It's looking at them as an individual. How are they getting evaluated? What is success for them, and what are the stakes if they fail at this? And if you understand that beyond the grand policy stuff, you can make allies and people that actually in that work. Yes, it's not like we joined forces and we're the same team. He's on opposing team to me, but we were able to communicate and establish some kind of a bond that we both knew that we needed each other to succeed. This is my minder, the guard, the young officer that was with me 24/7 in this trip to North Korea. I managed to convey to him that I cannot succeed unless he succeeds. And once he understood that, we didn't have to play games. He just asked me the questions. I provided him the information. And I know that he genuinely wanted us to be successful. So he always also gave me some tips and some things around how to approach things, how to avoid landmines when I speak.
Mickey, what's the history of your involvement in Myanmar? And why did you have to extract yourselves from a rather tense situation?
Yeah, it's a tense and funny story, actually. I think it's the closest story I have in my book about a moment that is close to the Argo moment in the movie Argo, from when they take off from Iran and the police is chasing the plane. Very similar to North Korea, our work in Myanmar started with engagement, not with a crisis, not stepping in when we needed something, but actually in 2012, when Myanmar announced that they're going to go through elections in 2015, so 3 years before the elections, and we knew that they're going to at least attempt to go and transition into democracy from a military government rule to a civilian government rule. And Governor Richardson, who knew Aung San Suu Kyi from 20 years before that, when she was in house arrest and he was a young member of Congress and he visited her, we went to see her in her house. She was still in opposition at the time. And we went to see the vice president at the time, who was a military leader. And we asked them, you have elections in 3 years. How can we help? How can we be good friends to you? And both of them said the same thing. They say, one, we need you to come and train our political elites. That we need the parliamentarians to be trained. We need the people who are running for elections to be trained, because we don't have a culture and experience of this. Our members of parliament never served the constituency. It was always just a military retirement plan. And now they're going to have to run elections in their districts. And we needed to do that. And so very quickly, because we're such a small organization, we're able to move very quickly. And within 3 months, I was back in the ground in Myanmar. That was in early 2013, doing the first ever training, parliamentarian training over there, with a group of 5 young elected officials from the US. One of them was a young mayor from South Bend, Indiana, Mayor Pete, who was even younger than he is now at the time, but just as brilliant, by the way. And we trained anywhere from Aung San Suu Kyi herself, her party, but also the military party, because we wanted to make sure that the playing field is leveled, and that we work with all of them. We worked with across the ethnic groups. We worked across genders and parties. And by the time the elections came, 3 years after that, 25% of the new parliament that was elected went through our training. That's the level of, and by the way, that was not big budget. These were not like big things that we did. It was the weekend here, weekend there. We had a contractor on the ground, Mindy Walker, who was training with volunteers there. And she trained about 3,500 people who were running in elections in a short time, in a really, really tiny budget. But it was impactful in a way that they knew us and they liked us, at least a big chunk of them. And while we were doing all of that, there was something brewing to the west of Myanmar, in a Myanmar state called Rakhine, where there is a minority, a Muslim minority called the Rohingyas. And back in 2012, 2013, when we were just starting, there was some clashes there. And there were about 30,000 refugees, and we thought it was a big deal back then. And we raised it. I remember raising it with Aung San Suu Kyi at the time. And she said, but it will not be smart of us to talk about it now. We need to focus on winning the elections. In my mind, I completed her sentence. I'm saying, once I win the elections, I will, of course, deal with this issue. She never said that, but that was my impression. So we chose to go fully on the transition to democracy, even by avoiding what was happening, increasing violence towards the Rohingyas. And elections came, elections went, Aung San Suu Kyi's parties won, but the violence there just kept escalating. And by 2017, there were 1.3 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. There were hundreds of thousands of them that were killed or lost at sea when they tried to escape. And at that point, Aung San Suu Kyi called Governor Richardson and said, hey, I want to invite you to participate in this international group of friends of mine to help us with this crisis. And we thought, boy, this is a great opportunity. Finally, we've done the democracy stuff. Now we can work on something tangible, on the thing that was really bothering us, that we had to look away in order to do the democracy stuff. But, it's a genocide. Plus, at that time, her government was holding 2 Reuters journalists in prison because they reported about mass killing in that conflict. One of them happens to be a friend of mine, Wallon, who I met throughout the training stuff and really liked him. And I thought that's a great time, because we're going to go there. She needs our help. She invited us. My assumption was she invited us because she needed a group of friends to give her cover and space to push the military a little bit to be able to get tangible things. That was the assumption. She's a friend. She wants to do the right thing. So all we need to do is provide her the space and we can get tangible things. And we thought that releasing the 2 journalists will be a great first gesture, allow us to do it. And so we went there, and the governor started the meeting with that. He told her Sue. That's how we used to call her, Sue. Probably the only person in the world that called her that. We've been friends for 20 years. We're glad to be here. We're all your friends. We want to help you with this. In order to help us help you, we need you to do some tangible things so we can go and broadcast to the world that you're heading in the right direction. You need to release those 2 journalists. And the meeting blew up. First, because she was not alone. She had staff and she had other ministers there. And she dug in. And not only did she say that those journalists were traitors and they'll be tried as such and sentenced as such, she then threw a sentence out in the air that blew my mind in a negative way. She said, when will you in the West stop trying to impose Muslims on Myanmar? And I had this glass shattering sound in my brain, because suddenly the image of the person I thought I was meeting, this was my 7th or 8th meeting with her. Suddenly just oh my God, I got it all wrong. In that instant, I realized that I have led Governor Richardson with absolutely wrong assumptions and therefore strategy about her. And it's not that Aung San Suu Kyi is a bad person. She's not evil or anything like that. She's complicated, like most of us. And she has done so many important things for her country and for her people, both in the transition to democracy and in reconciling, doing peace and reconciliation work between the different ethnic groups, as long as they're Buddhists. She has a blind side when it comes to Muslims that I didn't see, that she never hit, but I never saw because of my own cognitive bias. But that meant that the whole strategy was set to fail. And the meeting devolved into a screaming match. And we knew that the governor had to leave the country. But if we told him that, we were still stuck deep inside the country. If we told them that ahead of time, they would have been able to spin it out before we had the ability to talk and for the governor to tell his truth. So we had to come up with a plan of how the governor still is able to set the tone of what took place over there. So because he wanted to call her out on what was happening, but do that before we actually get detained. And so we had to come up, and that was my military training kicked into action. We had to come up with a plan of how we're able to fly from the capital in Naypyidaw, which doesn't have international airport, or at the time didn't have an international airport. We had to fly domestically to Yangon, and there pick up an international plane to fly to Tokyo. But as soon as you put yourself on the manifest, they will know that you're leaving. And therefore, they will blow up the story. So I booked us on 5 different trips in 5 consecutive days and told them, I don't know what the governor is going to do. Right now, he's staying. He's trying to figure it out, but I have to give him options. And we picked up a timing in which we knew there will all be in helicopters on the way to Rakhine State. And 2 minutes before the helicopter took off, I got out of the governor's room and I said, hey, the governor woke up this morning. He's not feeling that well. We're going to sit out this trip, but we'll see you when you come back. Because we knew that the helicopter ride was an hour and a half. And that was the time we had to get ourselves on a domestic flight, to fly to Yangon, do a discreet interview with a couple of journalists that will be embargoed until I press send from the plane on the way up so they can send it out. And that's what it played out. There's a story, I tell it in the book. It's way more with twists and turns. But essentially, we were almost detained in Yangon. And when we were on the plane, I waited until the engines were rumbling and we started rolling. And then I pressed send to the journalist and it went through. And by the time we landed in Tokyo 6 hours later, I showed the governor there was a story from the Minister of Information that we have violated some laws. Like I told you, they would have detained us. I was vindicated. But I left on that flight, James, I felt like I failed on 3 levels. First, I failed my friend Wallon. He was in jail and I was not getting him out. Now, he got out about 100 days later, not because of my efforts, but I failed him. I failed the governor because I was the one that came up with the personality analysis and the profile of Aung San Suu Kyi and what she really wanted. And based on that, we built a strategy. And because of my cognitive bias, I didn't see what was the reality of it. And therefore, the mission failed. And third, this was my 11th visit to the country. I really love this country. I love the people. And I was running away from it, thinking I would never come back. But as you know very well, in our world, there's twists and turns. And 3 years later, this was in 2018, 3 years later, there was a coup in Myanmar. And Aung San Suu Kyi was removed from power by the military. Ironically, by the way, she was charged with the same act, the Secrets Act, that the journalists were charged with. And she's still in prison now in house arrest. And the Burmese military took an American journalist, Danny Fenster from Detroit, and held him hostage. And because we had that big fight, public fight with Aung San Suu Kyi, and I thought that we would never be allowed back into the country, because we had that public fight, the military really liked us. So they invited us and they wanted to prove that where Aung San Suu Kyi failed in hosting her friends of 20 years, the military government can show how it's done with people who are not necessarily their friends. And that was the door that we walked into and were able to, within 6 months of his arrest, to bring Danny Fenster back home to his parents in Detroit.
Great story. Mickey, you got involved in an Iranian hostage case. What was the outcome on that?
Yeah, I was involved in several of them. The latest were not included in the book because they were not concluded by the time I finished the book. And I didn't want to write, with the exception of Paul Whelan in Russia, I didn't want to write anything in my book about an active case because they didn't want to harm the chances of their release. But during the pandemic and during the first Trump administration, we were involved in a case of an American Princeton student, PhD student from Princeton, Chiu Wang. And he was held in Iran. He was doing his studies over there for his PhD, his field research, and he was arrested there for espionage. And the Iranians, we made contact with them. The foreign minister at the time was Zarif, who's a very charming and charismatic individual, smooth talker, a nice guy, really, on a personal level. And we engaged with him. And the first time we met him, and he said, look, he told me and the governor, we offered a global exchange of prisoners to Donald Trump, and he said no. So why are you here? And I remember I told the foreign minister, look, I think you misunderstand President Trump. And he said, President Trump does want to bring Americans back home, but he doesn't want to look as if he's paying a big price for it. That's not his style. And Zarif asked me, so what do we do with this? And I said, we break it down. We do one for one, and we find ways of doing that. And I know that the Iranians are very, very high on reciprocity and symmetry, very much like the Russians, by the way. And since Chiu Wang was an academic, we needed to find an Iranian academic who was held in the US and figure out whether that is somebody that the US is willing to exchange in return for Chiu Wang. And Zarif played ball with us. And he said, let me do that. I need to get authorization from the supreme leader. I need to get authorization from my prime minister. I need to get authorization from the Revolutionary Guard, because without those three, nothing will happen. And pretty quickly, he said yes. And we took it to the White House at the time. That was Robert O'Brien, was the national security advisor. And Chris Miller, before he became the Secretary of Defense, was at the National Security Council as well at that time. And remember, we had meetings with them on this, and initially they were very excited about this because it was a way to do it. We found this Iranian academic named Soleimani, not the famous Soleimani who was the head of the Quds forces, but he was a medical doctor who was actually coming to the US on a valid visa to do research. And his visa was revoked while he was on the plane on the way to the US. So he was arrested as soon as he landed. And he was pending trial in Atlanta. And so it was a relatively easy thing. And they liked it initially. And then they told us that it's not going to work. They, meaning the National Security Council. And we asked him why. And he said, because the Department of Justice is against it. And when I had a private conversation, again, these are personal relationships. When I've had a private conversation with a good friend there inside the NSC, I asked him why. And he said, well, truth is, it's not like we can go to the Department of Justice and dig in, because there's certain procedures of what we are allowed and what we're not allowed to. So I don't know why, but they're very adamant against it. And I asked him, is it okay with you if I go to the Department of Justice and ask them? He said, absolutely, do your thing. So Governor Richardson and I, and Ambassador Cameron Hume, was a retired ambassador who works with us, went and met with then Attorney General Bill Barr, sorry. And we sat, and again, one of those things, it's Governor Richardson and Bill Barr sit in the room. Obviously, they're political opponents of each other over the years, but they're sitting like the two old men. It's like, I remember we did something together while I was in Congress. Like, yeah, I remember that. It was good. Do you remember what it is? I have no idea, but I remember it was good. And they're laughing and they're having that kind of warm-up. That was Richardson's magic. And we explained the situation to the Attorney General. And he had his leadership team with him. And he said, why aren't we going to do it? And his leadership team was very honest with us. They said 2 reasons. Number one, the guy has not stood trial yet. And we can't interfere in the judicial process before this completes. And number two, we do not want to set an example of a tarmac exchange. We just don't want to do that. We don't want to set it up because that will be the pretext for everything else. And so we took that because that was 2 legitimate reasons. And we thought about it and we came up with a solution. We told him, what if we're able to get this guy to plead guilty? So he gets We get he is guilty. Check on the prosecutor's side. And then he gets deported. And when he gets deported, we get a promise from the Iranians that 2 days later, they will deport Chiu Wang. So it's not a tarmac exchange. Yes, it's riskier because they might cheat, even though we knew that they will not, because it's always a repeat game. It's not a one-time game. But that was the deal with it. And we actually worked with the prosecutor in Atlanta who really wanted this to be played out because he didn't really have a case for the trial. And so it was all set up and we were prepared to go December 14th. It was supposed to happen 2019. And then the State Department realized that it was going to happen with or without them. And I think, and I can be cynical about it, but I can also give them the credit that I think they were worried that the Iranians will cheat, that we will release Soleimani and they will not reciprocate the way they promised us. So they picked up Soleimani without us from jail and did a tarmac exchange in Geneva and got Chiu Wang. It hurt, I have to say, because we worked all the details of it and then they kind of scooped to do it. But at the end of the day, the American was home. So that's all that really mattered to us. And we had a second one there, Michael White, another American, a former Navy guy. And 6 months later, we were able to construct another deal and then find a way to get the Trump administration to do that deal without us. And Michael White came home as well.
Mickey described the Poe and Trevor Reed cases. And what happened when you and Governor Richardson flew into Moscow on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, we started working on Paul Whelan pretty early on at the request of his sister Elizabeth, and the Russians took him about the same time that Marina Butina, the Russian spy, was caught here in the U.S. And it was pretty obvious that the Russians were kind of looking at making a deal there, except that the U.S. sentenced her for 18 months plus time served. So she was, by the time we were all gearing up to these conversations, Marina Butina basically had about 6 months left. And so for 6 months, the Russians are not in a hurry anywhere. It's like, yeah, she'll serve her 6 months and then she goes free. That's fine. So they wanted something else for Paul Whelan. And there's a long story there of what we started doing, a little bit of trust building things. We provided dental work for a Russian prisoner here that needed it, Konstantin Yaroshenko, and they provided medical treatment for Paul Whelan. And we started building that up over time. And then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, we kind of we sat with the Russians and said, okay, let's get straight to the end game here, because we don't want any Russian prisoners to die here, and you don't want any American prisoners to die in Russia with this pandemic thing that we really didn't know what we were dealing with at the beginning. And they wanted Konstantin Yaroshenko for Paul Whelan. We took it to, this was under Trump, we took it to the Trump White House. There was just no interest. So the Russians took another American, Trevor Reed, not only former Marine, but former presidential guard from Camp David. And over there, we already had a conversation with the Russians, and they wanted 2 for 2. And they gave us 2 names. We took it to the White House. This was already Biden administration. It already transitioned. And the Biden administration told us, thank you so much. We got it from here. And then nothing happened. And the reason why we know nothing happened is not because the Americans told us, but because the Russians told us. We have that's the source of information we have. We don't have security clearance, so the Americans don't share much with us. We get our information from the other side. But when the situation started hitting in Ukraine, we realized that there might be an opportunity in this crisis, because the Russians still wanted to have channels. And we managed to get invited into Russia in late February. And that was based on the fact that Governor Richardson and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov were both ambassadors to the UN at the same time. So they had a long relationship between them. And we tried to get into Russia before, but that's when we got invited. And so we ended up flying on Fred Smith. He's the CEO of FedEx. He lent us his plane to go there because he's a former Marine himself. And he lent us his plane. We went in there. James, we woke up at 5 a.m. the next morning in the Red Square to see the announcement of the invasion. And that was a very surreal experience, But we did come back from that trip with a tangible 2-option deal for the White House. One is a 2-for-2, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed, and one was just for Trevor Reed in return for Konstantin Yaroshenko, mainly because Trevor Reed was coughing blood in the Russian prison, and we suspected it was a active TB infection, which is not deadly except for in a Russian jail in the middle of a pandemic. We presented both these options to the White House. They chose to do the Trevor Reed only, so Paul Whelan was left behind. But even that was a struggle because the negotiations with the Russians were not the hardest part of it. Getting the White House to agree to it was even harder. And it's not because the White House didn't want Americans home. They did. And it's not because they're bad people. They're good people. But because they were trying to figure out whether that kind of exchange is even legitimate or what the larger consequences of that. And they have to carry that responsibility. I don't, because I only work for the release of the prisoners. So it's simpler to me than it is to them. But still, we did what we needed to do in order to convince them, a little bit put them in the corner. That cost me some personal relationships over there. But Trevor Reed came home.
Mickey, how did the Brittney Griner arrest change the landscape of hostage negotiations?
Yeah, I think Brittney Griner is, when she was taken, was the single most famous prisoner that I've ever dealt with. There are some prisoners that became famous as they were taken. Otto Warmbier became very famous throughout, but she was famous before, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why she was picked. Vladimir Putin understands the US sometimes better than we do understand ourselves. He understood what it meant to take a female Olympian, Black American basketball hero who happens to be gay, and how it will play out in the American public. Her agent and her wife, her agent Lindsay and her wife Sherelle, reached out, and we talked as soon as she got arrested, or a little bit after she was arrested. But they officially asked us to help the day that Trevor Reed was released, because they realized our role in that. The key on that, there was so much complexities, but one of the most important things there, we knew, unlike other prisoners, because Brittney Griner is such a high profile, that her family can see President Biden when they want to. But there was no reason to see President Biden before there is a tangible option on the table. Because then the president will just say, we're trying to work it, but we don't have anything yet. You want to hold on that opportunity until there is an option on the table, and then you meet the president and convince him to go for it, because the president is very empathetic. And when he meets a family like that, he wants it done. And so the Griner team was building up all of the public pressure that they needed, but did not push for a meeting with the president until September, when I told them, get a meeting with the president mid-September, because governor and I will be in Moscow and we're coming back with a tangible proposal. And that's what they did. And when we came back, we had a tangible proposal for both Paul Whelan and Brittney Griner. And they met with the president, they pushed him. And we have worked collaboratively with the White House, trying everything we could to see through that deal. It was agonizing 2.5 months, at the end of which the White House has concluded that they couldn't get the 2-for-2. So they pulled a 1-for-1, because at the end of the day, you bring who you can when you can, because you never can count that you can do that again later. And Brittney came home and was still left behind.
Mickey, is there anything that you'd like to share with our audience, your thoughts of working with Governor Richardson and the impact that he has had on your activities and on the Richardson Center?
Yes, I have to say, So Governor Richardson, first of all, I worked with him for about 18 years, 17 years, I guess. I can describe him, those who knew him will understand exactly what I say. I can describe him as my 6-year-old father figure, because he was both a father figure for me. My father passed away in 2012. He was both a father figure for me, but also my 6-year-old son that I had to deal with, because he had that kind of personality. But he taught me half of what I know about this. And he had a very different personality than I did. He was the more classic negotiator, the bully when he needed to, the bluffer when he needed to, the joker when he needed to. I'm very different personality, so I negotiate differently. And he used to make fun of me. He used to say that I'm a weak man because of it. But we worked really, really well together. Our personalities really worked as we were playing tag team on these negotiations. He had a gift, James. His ability to conduct himself and communicate with other human beings and to read them was instinctual, was gut. It was not intellectualized. Quite the opposite. Every time I would try to intellectualize it, to say, hey, what you did here is, and he was just, enough with the riffraff. Because when somebody has such a gift, they can't see why others don't see it. I don't have that gift. I had to learn it from him. And I had to intellectualize and practice it myself. And when he died, it probably was a big surprise to him because he thought he was immortal. It wasn't a big surprise for me, and not because I didn't expect it. He wasn't sick or anything like that. He was surprised in the timing of it. But I knew he was mortal, and I knew that he was aging, and I already had some thoughts, and I talked about it with him of what happens. How does the work continue in the event that he can't do this anymore? And before he passed away, we've already teamed up with this business guy, insurance guy from Omaha named Steve Menzies, who's a very successful businessman. And during the pandemic, Steve lent us his plane because there were no commercial flights to do these negotiations. And Steve's condition was that he's coming with us. And so Steve came with us to Venezuela. He came with us to Russia. He did a rescue with us from Russia. And just like what happened to me in 2006 happened to Steve. He got bit by the bug. And he really saw the value in this. And so at the governor's funeral, Steve and I got together and he said, Mickey, we have to continue this work. And no, we don't have another Governor Richardson. We can't invent that person. But are there smaller scale Richardsons out there that we can collect as a pool of people who are willing to be called on by us and act in specific cases and lend us their credentials for this? And he tasked me at putting together Global Reach, which is the organization that emerged out of the Richardson Center, and that is we're still in our first year of operation. And we have expanded, with Richardson, we did the mediation and the negotiations. With Global Reach, we added investigative capabilities that we never had before because we have commercially available intelligence that we can buy, digital, human, and that helps us trace and find certain missing Americans. It helps us understand who has them and therefore what they might want in return. We have the ability to do personality research and relationship research. So all these things that Richardson used to do by gut, we now actually are looking at and seeing and building up strategies based on that. And we have a strategic communication capability for the families that we never had before, training them and knowing how to use the public domain only when it helps getting somebody home, not just for the sake of putting your face on CNN. And we have been collecting that pool of advisory board of people, bipartisan, cross regions, cross sectors, who are willing to lend their names, and we're using that. And that was the birth of Global Reach. And that is what moves us forward.
So the work's going to continue.
The work is going to continue. And in closing, I will say this, James, one of the biggest things, my job is to get people home. So I need to deploy empathy. I need to be good friends with some of these people and find ways into their hearts and to move them emotionally, to change the way they make decisions or influence their behavior in order to get Americans home. But we need to figure out how we deter this behavior going forward, how to mitigate that. We can't prevent it, but I do believe that we're strong enough as a country. We have strong enough agencies and capabilities to deter it. I do believe that the deterrence cannot be on the backs of those Americans who are being held. So claiming that we stop negotiating because it incentivizes taking more Americans, that doesn't pass the moral test, because that means that we're using our own hostages as hostages to our inability to pull deterrence. But the truth is that once they're back, we need to do everything we can to bring them back. Once they're back, we need to figure out how to punish, how to create accountability, and how to deter. And James, it's not sanctions. Those countries, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, North Korea, even though North Korea has been out of that business since Otto Warmbier. They're the most sanctioned countries in the world. So more sanctions, that's not going to make any sense or any difference. We need to have stronger things. And that's the part that I don't speak publicly about because that's my responsibility to bring people home. But privately, I am engaged. I'm a commissioner in a CSIS commission on building deterrence, on recommendations to the administration of how to do this. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that on hostages by terrorist organizations, and there are ways of doing that with governments. Those measures are a little grandiose. It includes in them, once people come home, figure out who are the people who wronged them, indict them, not put sanctions, indict them in American courts, and if possible and when possible, bring them to justice. And a few of those will start sending a message, but that's high risk and high complexity. But I wanted to throw that thought as we close here, because we have to treat this as a national security emergency crisis, and it is. And that means that we need to be bold in what we do in return for this.
Well, the name of the book is In the Shadows. It is a fascinating read. As many examples as Mickey gave to us today, there are that many more in the book. So I recommend it enthusiastically to our audience. And I want to thank Mickey for really a fascinating interview.
Thank you so much, James.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.